The moment happened in the summer of 1944, high over occupied France, when air combat had become a daily gamble with death. Lieutenant Royce Priest was flying escort in his P-51 Mustang when everything went wrong in seconds. Ahead of him, his squadron commander's fighter was suddenly engulfed in flames, black smoke pouring from the engine as the aircraft began to fall toward the countryside below. Priest watched in disbelief as the Mustang spiraled down behind enemy lines. The man inside that burning cockpit wasn't just another pilot. He was the leader of the squadron, the man Priest had studied, admired, and followed since joining the unit. In a matter of moments, that man was about to become a prisoner of war. The cause was an ambush no one had seen coming. German anti-aircraft crews had turned deception into an art. Guns were hidden inside farm buildings, haystacks, even rail cars marked with medical symbols. When the American fighters came in low for a strafing run, the sides of a railway boxcar dropped away, revealing heavy cannons already aimed at them. The attack was sudden, precise, and devastating. By this point in the war, American fighter losses over France were rising fast. Pilots flying low-altitude missions were exposed to concealed fire from every direction. Some were killed instantly. Others crash-landed in enemy territory and vanished into prison camps. A few were never found at all. The squadron commander, who had just been shot down, was not supposed to be flying that mission. As a senior officer, he could have stayed back. But he believed in leading from the front. His aggressive style had made him one of the most successful pilots in the group, and it had also placed him directly in harm's way. Priest had looked up to him long before the war. When they were assigned to the same squadron, Priest considered it the greatest break of his career. He studied every maneuver, every tactic, trying to learn from the man he now watched disappear below the tree line. Standard procedure was clear. When a pilot went down behind enemy lines, wingmen were to mark the location, report it, and return to base. Rescue was not just discouraged, it was considered impossible. The P-51 Mustang was a single-seat fighter. There was no room for passengers, no plan for landing in fields, no training for extraction. Priest heard the order crackle over the radio. Abort. Leave the area. Return to England. His hand moved toward the switch, and then it stopped. Because in that moment, Royce Priest made a decision no manual had prepared him for. A decision that would defy physics, regulations, and common sense. He pushed the nose of his Mustang down and followed the burning aircraft toward the ground. Priest ignored the order echoing in his headset and committed to the descent. Below him stretched fields of tall wheat, golden and uneven, broken by hedgerows and dirt roads. This was occupied territory, German patrols everywhere. Landing here was madness. But letting his commander be taken was unthinkable. The P-51 Mustang was never meant to touch down on farmland. Its liquid-cooled engine sat low, the radiator scoop exposed beneath the belly. One hidden rock or deep rut could rupture the cooling system and destroy the engine instantly. The landing gear was designed for concrete runways, not soft soil. Every calculation said this would end in a flipped aircraft or a dead pilot. Priest lined up anyway. He lowered the flaps, slowed the aircraft to the edge of a stall, and judged his height by the blur of wheat rushing past his wingtip. The nose blocked his forward view completely. He could not see where he was going, only where he had been. The wheels hit hard. The Mustang bounced once, then again, then slammed down into the earth. Wheat stalks whipped against the fuselage as Priest stood on the brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft straight. The fighter shuddered, lurched, and finally rolled to a stop just short of the tree line. He spun the aircraft around immediately, pointing it into the wind. If he had to take off under fire, there would be no time to turn around. Above him, the remaining Mustangs circled low, stunned by what they had just witnessed. They scanned roads and hedges for movement. It came fast. A military truck appeared on a dirt road to the east, racing toward the field. Another followed from the north. A motorcycle cut in from the south. German patrols were converging. The escorts dove without hesitation. Tracer fire stitched across the road, shredding the first truck and sending it into a ditch. The second was hit moments later. But ammunition was limited. They could buy time, not control the field. Priest climbed out of his cockpit and searched the tree line. Smoke rose from the woods where his commander had gone down. Every pilot carried thermite charges to destroy their aircraft after a crash. That meant the man he was waiting for would emerge with nothing but his flight suit, and German soldiers would not be far behind. Seconds passed, then minutes. The escort pilots strafed again, scattering troops advancing through the wheat. Priest knew the math was turning against him. Soft ground had carved deep ruts behind his wheels. Taking off would require every inch of the field. Adding a second man to a single-seat cockpit would push the aircraft far beyond its limits. Then a figure broke from the trees. It was the squadron commander, running hard, suit blackened with soot, face twisted with fury. He was waving his arms not in relief, but in anger. He was shouting for Priest to leave without him. Priest answered without words. He climbed onto the wing, unbuckled his parachute, and threw it into the wheat. Then he removed his survival dinghy and tossed that away as well. Without a parachute, he could not bail out. Without a dinghy, he would drown if they went down in the channel. He was making his intention unmistakable. The commander stopped running. German soldiers were now visible above the wheat, helmets bobbing as they advanced. The escorts had maybe one pass left. Priest did not look away. He was not leaving alone. The squadron commander reached the aircraft just as rifle fire began cracking from the edge of the field. German soldiers were spreading out, moving carefully through the wheat, closing the distance with every second. The escorting Mustangs dove one last time, raking the advancing line with gunfire, but their ammunition was nearly gone. This was the final window. The commander climbed onto the wing and looked down into the cockpit. What waited for him was not a seat, but an impossibility. The P-51's cockpit was barely wide enough for one pilot in full gear. It was built around a single armored seat, a control stick rising from the floor, and instruments packed tightly against the canopy rail. There was no space for a second body, no straps, no handholds, no plan. But there was no time to argue. The commander lowered himself in first, sliding down as far as he could, his back pressed against the armor plate, his legs forced under the instrument panel alongside the control stick. Priest climbed in after him, settling onto his commander's lap, their bodies compressed together like cargo in a crate. Their helmets nearly touched the canopy glass. Priest reached up and pulled the canopy closed. It latched with barely an inch of clearance. Inside, the August heat became unbearable instantly. Air barely circulated. Sweat poured down their faces. Breathing was shallow and difficult. Outside, German soldiers were now clearly visible, rifles raised. Priest shoved the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared to full power, its propeller clawing at the air. The overloaded Mustang began to roll, dragging itself through the wheat with painful slowness. The extra weight pushed the aircraft far beyond anything it had been designed to carry. Airspeed climbed, too slowly. 60 miles per hour. 70. 80. The tree line at the far end of the field rushed toward them. A normal Mustang lifted off at around 100 miles per hour. With 2 men aboard, Priest estimated he needed at least 115. The gauge read 95. As the trees filled the windscreen, Priest pulled back on the stick. The wheels left the ground. The aircraft staggered into the air, barely climbing. Warning horns screamed. Branches scraped the belly of the fuselage. Then, suddenly, they were clear. The Mustang clawed upward, gaining altitude inch by inch. Below them, German soldiers burst from the wheat and watched the aircraft escape westward, disbelief frozen on their faces. 2 men, 1 seat, against every law of aerodynamics. But the danger was far from over. The aircraft was dangerously overweight. The engine was already overheating from the strain. And ahead lay nearly 200 miles of hostile territory, dotted with flak batteries and enemy airfields. Priest leveled out at low altitude, easing back on the throttle to keep the engine alive. The escort fighters formed up on either side, no longer attackers, but guardians. Inside the cockpit, the heat was suffocating. The commander's legs were pinned beneath Priest's weight. Circulation cut off completely. He could not move even an inch. Priest's knees pressed against the control panel, limiting movement of the stick. Every input had to be precise. One wrong motion could jam the controls and end them both. White vapor began streaming from the radiator. The Merlin engine was slowly cooking itself. They had escaped the field. Now they had to escape France. The Mustang pressed westward at low altitude, skimming over fields and villages that blurred together beneath the wings. Priest kept the aircraft just high enough to glide if the engine failed, but low enough to stay beneath most radar coverage. It was a narrow band of airspace, and he flew it with absolute concentration. The engine temperature needle crept higher with every passing minute. Wheat stalks and dirt had been sucked into the radiator during the ground roll. Airflow was restricted, coolant streaming away in a pale trail behind the aircraft. The Merlin was being pushed beyond its limits, carrying far more weight than it was ever designed to lift. Priest knew the signs. If the temperature reached the red line and stayed there, the engine would seize without warning. Inside the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating just as fast. The canopy trapped heat like a greenhouse. Sweat soaked both men's flight suits within minutes. The commander's legs, pinned beneath Priest, began to go numb. First his feet, then his calves, then his thighs. He clenched his jaw and said nothing. Any distraction could be fatal. Priest focused on the gauges he could still see. Fuel pressure, oil temperature, manifold pressure. Some instruments were partially blocked by his knees, forcing him to lean and twist just to confirm readings. His elbows were pressed tight against his ribs by the cockpit walls. The control stick rose between his legs with barely enough clearance to move. Every control input had to be smooth and deliberate. A sudden correction could jam the stick against the other pilot's legs and send the aircraft into a roll it might not recover from. The escort fighters kept a close watch, scanning the sky for German interceptors. Their ammunition was nearly gone. If enemy fighters appeared now, they could do little more than warn Priest and hope speed and terrain were enough. The French countryside slid beneath them, mile after mile. Flak positions dotted the route. Priest adjusted course constantly, weaving between known gun sights, trusting memory and instinct. Each minute spent over enemy territory increased the odds that someone on the ground would spot them and call it in. The engine temperature needle touched the red line. Priest faced a brutal choice. He could pull back power, cool the engine, and extend its life, but risk running out of daylight before reaching the coast. Or he could maintain speed and hope the Merlin held together long enough to reach friendly territory. He chose speed. Better to go down in the channel, where rescue boats patrolled, than crash back into German hands. The escort pilots saw the white coolant trail growing longer and exchanged worried glances. They knew what it meant. Time was running out. Then, at last, the coastline appeared ahead. The white edge of the Cottonton Peninsula slid beneath the nose. Allied territory. Friendly ground. Priest allowed himself a single breath of relief. But the hardest part was still ahead. The English Channel stretched before them, cold, gray, and unforgiving. 20 miles of water. Priest had thrown away his dinghy in the wheat field. The commander had abandoned his with his burning aircraft. If the engine quit now, there would be no second chances. The temperature needle quivered at the limit. The Merlin kept running. They pushed on. The channel crossing felt longer than the entire flight over France. Below them, the water churned in dull shades of gray and green, broken only by white caps driven by the wind. Priest kept his eyes locked on the gauges, listening to every change in engine tone, waiting for the moment the Merlin would finally give up. The temperature needle hovered at the red line, trembling as if unsure whether to climb higher or fall back. Priest adjusted the mixture and radiator controls by fractions, searching for balance that might buy them a few more minutes. Every second mattered now. Inside the cockpit, the heat became unbearable. Sweat ran into Priest's eyes, stinging his vision. The commander beneath him could barely feel his legs anymore. Pins and needles spread upward as circulation remained cut off. He focused on breathing, counting seconds in his head, refusing to panic. Halfway across the channel, the engine began to misfire. The smooth roar fractured into an uneven stutter, each cough sending a jolt of fear through the cockpit. Priest tightened his grip on the controls and pushed the nose down slightly to maintain airspeed. If the engine quit entirely, he would need altitude and momentum to have any chance at a controlled ditching. There was no room for error. Priest glanced to either side. The escort fighters were still there, wings rocking gently in the turbulence. They could not help if the engine failed, but their presence meant something. It meant Priest was not alone. Minutes dragged on. Then, through the haze ahead, land appeared. England. The coastline emerged slowly, almost unreal after so much water. Cliffs gave way to fields, roads, and familiar patterns that marked safety. Priest felt a surge of relief so strong he had to force himself to stay focused. Reaching land did not mean survival. The aircraft was still failing. The Merlin sputtered again, louder this time. The misfires became more frequent, the rhythm breaking down. Priest knew he had only minutes, perhaps less, before the engine seized completely. He turned inland, aiming for the nearest airfield. The Mustang shuddered as overheated cylinders began to fail one by one. Smoke seeped from the cowling. The vibration increased. The runway appeared ahead, still miles away. Priest kept the aircraft fast, resisting the urge to slow too early. With the extra weight, he needed every knot of airspeed he could get. He lowered the landing gear, felt the reassuring thud as the wheels locked into place, then brought the flaps down in stages. The engine coughed violently. The airfield rushed toward them. Priest flared at the last possible moment. The wheels slammed into concrete, tires screaming in protest. The Mustang rolled down the runway, engine bucking and sputtering, but still turning. Priest applied the brakes gently, afraid that any sudden movement might tear the aircraft apart. Then, finally, they stopped. The engine died the instant the propeller slowed. For a few seconds, there was only silence. They had made it. Before the propeller had fully stopped turning, ground crews were already running toward the Mustang. Fire trucks, ambulances, mechanics, everyone on the field had been warned that an aircraft in impossible condition was inbound. They expected to find a wounded pilot, perhaps a man barely clinging to life after nursing a crippled fighter home. What they did not expect was this. The canopy opened, and two men began to unfold themselves from a cockpit designed for one. First Priest climbed out, legs shaking, soaked in sweat, his flight suit darkened by exhaustion. Then the squadron commander tried to stand, and collapsed instantly. His legs had been compressed beneath Priest's weight for nearly 2 hours. Circulation had been cut off so completely that they no longer responded. Crewmen rushed forward and caught him before he hit the concrete. They carried him to a waiting ambulance while medics shouted instructions. Priest sat on the wing, breathing hard, the adrenaline finally draining from his system. The Mustang told its own story. Wheat stalks protruded from every opening. The landing gear wells were packed with debris. The radiator scoop was choked with vegetation, mud, and dirt. Coolant streaked the fuselage in long, white trails. Oil leaked from the cowling where the overheated engine had begun to fail. The ground chief took one look and shook his head. The Merlin engine, he said later, had been seconds from seizing solid. Mechanics worked for 2 full days to restore the aircraft. They dismantled the cooling system piece by piece, pulling out compressed straw and soil. Several coolant lines had ruptured and had to be replaced. The engine required a full inspection and partial rebuild before it was declared airworthy again. Word of what had happened spread across the base in minutes. Pilots gathered around the aircraft, touching the wings, peering into the cockpit, replaying the story aloud in disbelief. No one had ever seen anything like it. Other pilots had tried similar rescues before. Most ended in wrecked aircraft, captured men, or death. This was the first time anyone had landed a single-seat fighter behind enemy lines, loaded a second pilot, and flown both home. But admiration quickly turned into uncertainty. Priest had disobeyed direct orders twice. He had ignored commands from his squadron commander in the air and again on the ground. Regulations were clear. Disobeying a lawful order in combat was grounds for court-martial. In extreme cases, it could end a career, or worse. Priest knew this. As medics wheeled his commander away, Priest stood alone beside the Mustang and wondered whether he had just saved a life or destroyed his own future. The decision would not be his to make. It would land on the desk of the commander of the 8th Air Force. And that man knew something about impossible missions. For 3 days, Lieutenant Royce Priest waited. He was grounded, confined to base, allowed no contact with the outside world beyond basic duties. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he would be court-martialed. Others believed he would be quietly reassigned and forgotten. No one knew which way the decision would fall, not even Priest himself. The case moved up the chain of command until it reached the desk of General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle understood impossible missions better than most men alive. 2 years earlier, he had led a strike force of bombers off an aircraft carrier toward Japan, fully aware that none of the aircraft could return. He had risked everything on a mission that defied doctrine, and succeeded. For that, he had been rewarded, not punished. Now the situation was reversed. A young lieutenant had violated procedure, disobeyed orders, risked a valuable aircraft, and could easily have ended with 2 prisoners instead of 1 rescue. Regulations demanded discipline, precedent demanded restraint. But the outcome complicated everything. Doolittle reviewed every report, radio transcripts, escort pilot statements, maintenance logs documenting the condition of Priest's aircraft, medical reports describing the commander's injuries and recovery. The facts were undeniable. Priest had acted without authorization, and he had succeeded where no one else ever had. The general weighed the consequences carefully. The 8th Air Force was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. Morale depended on trust that if a man went down, he would not be abandoned without a fight. Priest's actions had demonstrated something powerful. They had shown that loyalty between pilots could outweigh fear, regulations, and even survival instincts. But there was another side. If Priest were rewarded too highly, others might attempt similar rescues and fail. The cost would be measured in aircraft and lives. The Air Force could not afford to encourage reckless heroics, no matter how noble the intent. Doolittle made his decision. There would be no court-martial. Instead, Priest would be recognized for extraordinary courage, but not in a way that turned his actions into policy. The Medal of Honor was considered, then set aside. In its place, Doolittle approved the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. The message was deliberate. What Priest had done was brave beyond question. It was also dangerously close to disastrous. The medal would honor the courage, while quietly acknowledging that such acts should remain the exception, not the rule. On the morning of the ceremony, pilots and ground crews assembled along the flight line. Priest stood at attention, uncertain whether relief or disappointment should dominate his thoughts. When General Doolittle stepped forward and pinned the medal to his chest, the weight of the moment finally settled in. Afterward, the general took Priest's hand and spoke quietly. He said that what Priest had done was the bravest and the most foolish thing he had witnessed in 2 years of commanding the 8th Air Force. Priest accepted the words without protest. He had expected punishment. Instead, he had been allowed to keep flying. But the story was not over yet. The war moved on quickly after the ceremony, as wars always do. New missions replaced old ones. Losses were counted, aircraft repaired, pilots rotated in and out of combat. But within the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force, the story of the Wheatfield rescue spread quietly, passed from pilot to pilot like something fragile and sacred. Major Burt Marshall recovered fully. The circulation in his legs returned, the pain faded, and within days, he was back in the cockpit. He resumed command of his squadron and continued flying combat missions through the fall of 1944, adding to his record and earning further decorations for leadership under fire. His capture would have been a severe blow to the unit. Instead, he remained exactly where his men needed him, leading from the front. Royce Priest returned to flying as well. He never sought attention for what he had done. When asked about the rescue, he redirected praise to the escort pilots who had bought him time and to the ground crews who rebuilt the Mustang he had nearly destroyed. He insisted that luck had played a greater role than skill. Those who knew better let him keep that belief. The rescue marked a turning point. Other pilots attempted similar extractions in the months that followed. Some succeeded, others failed and paid dearly. The Air Force never formally authorized such missions, but it never explicitly forbade them either. Commanders learned to look the other way when a pilot chose to risk everything for a comrade. When the war in Europe ended, both men carried the memory with them into peacetime. Marshall continued his Air Force career, eventually rising to senior command roles. Priest served for decades, flying aircraft that would have seemed impossible during the war years. Neither man considered the rescue the defining moment of his life, but both understood that it had changed them permanently. Years later, Priest wrote a letter to Marshall's son. In it, he described the hidden flak guns, the burning aircraft, the decision to land, and the moment he threw away his parachute. He explained that he had not calculated the odds or considered the regulations. He had simply refused to let the man he admired disappear into a prison camp. That letter became one of the most complete records of the event. The Mustang itself did not survive as a museum piece. It flew again, served out the war, and eventually vanished into surplus yards, like thousands of other aircraft. No plaque marks the field in France where it landed. No monument stands where two men squeezed into a cockpit, meant for one. And yet, the story endured. It endured because it captured something rare about war. Not destruction, but choice. In a conflict governed by orders, procedures, and overwhelming force, one pilot chose loyalty over safety. He chose action over obedience. He chose a comrade over his own future. That decision could have ended in failure. Instead, it carried two men home. And decades later, among those who know the history of the air war over Europe,